I have the honor to present Bertha Madras, and she will talk about the situation of cannabis in USA. I tried to read Bertha's CV, but I will take the 45 minutes to do that. So, can I ask Bertha to come to the stage? And could you please, very short, give us the best example of your career that has brought you here?
Which career?
The one that goes into this subject.
In policy, because I've worn 3 hats in my life, one as an educator, one as a scientist, and one as a policy person. But in policy, probably my proudest moment was to catalyze screening, brief intervention, and referral to treatment in the United States. We got billing codes for the project. We got almost every federal agency to do the screening. And we started with about 10 publications a year from scholars, and right now there are more than 800 publications based on it because there's so much interest in doing this as a form of prevention.
Thank you. And next time someone asks you this question, maybe you say, well, there was an event in Stockholm in 2023 that was another highlight.
Another highlight.
Yes, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for organizing this important event and also this important topic. To introduce it, I just ask you a very simple question. Why am I here? I'm here to reinforce your concerns about a movement to legalize all drugs. And if you persist, so why do I say that marijuana is no longer a plant? Well, these are some of the products that have taken over the dispensaries and the legal outlets for commercialization in different states. There are beverages, there are edibles, there are candies that appeal to children, there are concentrates. So our first topic is new cannabis. It's not a natural plant. Legalization has led to much higher potencies than ever before. Their potencies on average are greater than 15% THC, which is the most important constituent of marijuana, in the plant itself, up to 90% THC in concentrates. Just imagine, 90%. All these so-called therapeutic benefits of marijuana were done at concentrations of about 3 to 4 to 5%. The new products are made to be attractive to children, and their new delivery methods, vaping and dabbing and eating and drinking, which never existed before the legalization movement started. So what is this legalization movement in terms of potency? We started with about 3% THC in marijuana in the 1970s, and now we're up to more than 20 to 90%. Why? What's the advantage? Because it produces a greater high? Because it can produce more tolerance? What does tolerance mean? It means that the more you use, the less effective the same doses, so you have to keep using higher doses to get the same effect. And when you use higher doses and you use more frequently, the addictive potential goes up. And of course, there are more users once you legalize. And above all, there's more profit, because the motive is profit. Make no mistake about it. Why does potency matter? What are the trends in cannabis use, and what are the known public health consequences? Because this is new, it's only occurred in the past 10 years, we still don't know the full array of potential of what will happen to young people using these drugs at this potency. But why does THC potency matter? If you look at alcohol, a beer is about 4%, it could be a bit higher. A glass of wine is about 12%, and spirits are 40% plus. And everyone knows that a small glass of spirits can give you a real intoxicating effect that a single beer will not. If you look at cocaine, the history of cocaine, powder cocaine, which was a hydrochloride salt, could only be used by insufflating it or snorting it, rolling up a dollar bill or a euro and sniffing it. Well, you can't roll a euro because it's made out of metal. But anyhow, but the chemists were very smart. They're clever. The people who produce these drugs understand pharmacology and chemistry very well. And they figured out that if you complex cocaine to a sodium bicarbonate molecule instead of hydrochloride, that is such a weak bond with cocaine that once you heat it up, it'll free the bicarbonate and you'll get a free base directly into the brain. If you try to do that with hydrochloride cocaine, you can't, because the drug will fall apart with that heat, because the bond between the two is extremely tight. So they figured out that this is a great way to deliver 3 times more the dose to the brain than powder cocaine, and that's why crack was designed. With methamphetamine, it was the same. Methamphetamine sulfate was the powder. Crystal meth, in this case, is a hydrochloride. That's a weak bond for meth, and it produces a greater high. Whoops. And with marijuana, we now have 90% THC. Same principles hold. So, does legalization affect concentrate use? The recreational states are the ones in green, the medical only are the ones in blue, and the white and gray ones have no operational medical or retail outlets. And what we're seeing is that high potency products are more likely to be used by young people between ages of 18 and 20 or 21 and 29 in the states that have either medical or recreational, with recreational being even higher. They're more likely to be used as vape concentrates, as dabs, any use of concentrates, and more likely in terms of high and low potencies. So the concentrates are growing very rapidly and gaining popularity now in the country. If you use more cannabis more frequently, you get more cannabis use disorder, or we can call it addiction, but it's a spectrum of responses. So if you use yearly, the percent with cannabis use disorder is very low. With monthly, it's higher. With weekly, it's higher. And with daily, it's much higher. So again, the objective of advertising, of making it more potent, giving you more intoxicating effects, more euphoria, is to get you to use it more often. And the more often you use, the more likely you are to develop a cannabis use disorder. And if that's the case, you're going to be a repeat customer. Again, the profit motive holds. The greater the potency, the greater adolescent risk for high frequency marijuana use. So if young people, adolescents, use blunts or eat or vape or burn, there is a greater potency there's a greater probability of using marijuana frequently, but with concentrates, it's the greatest of all. And that's what's happening. What are the consequences of high versus low potency? In the olden days, we used to call less than 10% low potency and greater than 10% high potency. Greater than 10% can now be as much as 90%. With high potency versus low potency, there is more regular cannabis use amongst youth. There are more drug problems. There's more use of other drugs. There's more tobacco and alcohol use disorder. There's more major depression and anxiety, and more psychotic-like experiences. High THC potency is associated with higher risk across the age spectrum of psychosis and anxiety, a lower age for developing schizophrenia, impaired memory, impaired brain function, impaired driving, more emergency care, more uncontrolled vomiting, use of other drugs and other social problems, and more use, a higher risk for progression to addiction. So that's the first phase of what I call the consequences of legalization, was to develop and make available high-potency marijuana in those states that have legalized. Minnesota today joined the crowd. That was bad news, but there's good news. One other state, Texas, rejected medicalization today. What about vaping as a different and new method for delivery? Among kids, there are all kinds of devices to hide the use of marijuana, and vaping is by far the ideal. Because as we all know, when you vape or you inhale a drug, it gets to the brain much faster than when you eat it. And it also disguises the smoke, the characteristic smell of marijuana smoke. But along with vaping pens have come ingenuity in designing methods of vaping, including writing pens, a backpack that has a vaping machine attached, hoodies with little vaping devices, smart watches with vaping devices, iPhones with vaping devices, USB sticks with vaping devices. Let me see if there's a USB stick here that's smoking, no. And even these little toy-looking pens for children that are less than 14 that can order them online. Then we have flavors. Cannabis vaping is the major mode of use by US adolescents and young adults. The market has included not only Delta-9 THC, but cannabidiol, Delta-8, Delta-10 THC. They're sold as hemp products, Delta-8 and 10, because the Farm Bill made a legal loophole in the whole restrictive category of marijuana. Anything that's isolated from hemp is considered legal until that law will change, and I'm sure it will. Cannabis vaping has greater risk for lung injuries, for seizures, and for acute psychiatric symptoms. Vaping is rising, and it's erasing the gains that we have in smoking cessation. So we've dropped smoking in our young people dramatically from about 40% of 12th graders down to less than 10%. But alas, vaping has now reversed the trend. And the same is true with marijuana use in terms of frequency. Marijuana use, when declined, it has remained relatively stable amongst youth with some decline during the COVID period, but marijuana vaping continues to increase. What are some of the problems associated with vaping? The biggest problem is that marijuana smoking and marijuana vaping, those who smoke or vape are 3 times more likely to use tobacco products. And after the nation made a phenomenal effort and accomplishment in stopping young people from smoking cigarettes and becoming addicted to nicotine, there's now a gateway drug to becoming addicted to nicotine by using marijuana. And people, young people who use cigarettes, and e-cigarettes especially, are 3 times more likely to use marijuana. So every time we take steps forward, we take steps backward. Unregulated marijuana products like gummy bears, candies, have also given rise to tremendous increases in poisonous ingestions by little children. Most of them are 1 to 3 years old because they find them around the house of their parents who are using, and they don't understand that these are potentially toxic, nor are the parents exercising vigilance by making sure they don't use them. Let's take a look at what happens in terms of the emergency room visits with edibles versus inhaled. Inhaled cannabis is more likely than edibles to give rise to cannabis hyperemesis syndrome, which means uncontrolled vomiting, and that is increasing. It's 18% versus 8% of inhaled versus edibles. Edible cannabis is more likely to produce acute psychiatric symptoms. Why? Because you can't regulate the amount that you get in the brain. If you eat a brownie and the effects come only 2 hours later, you don't know that you've actually had an effective dose. So you'll eat another piece and another piece. And soon you'll eat 1 cookie and then 2 and 5. And pretty soon the amount that's getting into the brain is vast. So it gives rise to more acute psychiatric symptoms, more intoxication, and cardiovascular symptoms, almost double the amount compared to inhale. And edibles also have given rise to a very high percentage of ED visits, emergency department visits, even though this is in Colorado, the sales of edibles is a tiny fraction of the total. So they are a very hazardous form of the drug. Edibles and vaporized marijuana are associated with psychiatric symptoms in adolescents, which include conduct problems, depressive symptoms, anhedonia, sensation seeking. So what are some of the lessons we have learned from these new forms of marijuana that have resulted directly from commercialization and the wild, wild west of drugs in the United States? That the medical and public education is inadequate on negative consequences. Vast sums of money are invested to promote. Humanitarian pleas are motivated by financial and political concerns. Ballot initiatives have given rise to these states that have approved it, even though the medical community has not been at the forefront at all in promoting these for medical reasons. There's a new wave of unregulated high-potency drugs, and the medical and recreational uses has an unenforceable distinction. Most people using for medical use for recreational and vice versa. There is just no boundary anymore. And rogue clinics or dispensaries proliferate. And we all were told that the illegal market would disappear because we would tax and regulate and provide pristine products. In California, the illegal market has grown tremendously and is swamping the legal market. What are the consequences of cannabis to the unborn child? The simple way to prevent these consequences to the unborn child is not to use cannabis during pregnancy. But in one survey done in Colorado, 70% of the so-called medical dispensaries were advocating for use during pregnancy for pregnant women. And what we see over the past decades is that more women are using, more pregnant women are using in the first trimester, in the second trimester, in the third trimester of pregnancy. The use increased with normalization, medicalization, and commercialization. In order to understand the effects of marijuana on the unborn child, we have to understand a little bit of biology. So bear with me while I give you a little tour through the brain, just to understand why this is so, risky for the unborn child. So we have to recognize that drugs are imposters of the brain's chemical messages, and we'll understand that better in a few moments. This is a serotonin, which is a chemical message produced by the brain. And this is LSD, which produces hallucinations. It doesn't take rocket science to realize that LSD has a component in its structure that looks like serotonin. And that's why LSD targets the serotonin system in the brain. THC, the brain makes cannabinoids, mainly 2-arachidonyl glycerol and also anandamide. THC is an imposter of brain cannabinoids. It resembles but is not identical to. And that's the key. That is the key. A drug does not resemble, the drug resembles but is not identical to your brain's own chemical messages. What does that mean? Why does that translate into a risk for a young developing brain? So in normal communication, two people talk, one transmits a message, the other receives it, they may go back and forth, and the brain communicates very similarly. One nerve cell transmits a message, and it gets received by the next nerve cell, but the message is not a voice, it's a chemical that's squirted out, and alongside the neighbor there is receptors or receivers that pick up the message and interpret it. So in this case, 2AG is squirted out by one nerve cell to send a message. It's a cannabinoid made by the brain, and it triggers a signal. Marijuana, THC, comes along in uncontrolled amounts. It floods the receptors for cannabinoids, and the signals are very different than what 2AG will signal, your own brain's chemical message. They're louder, they're stronger, they last longer. That's why you generally are not intoxicated under normal conditions, because your endocannabinoid signaling system does not allow it to happen, because it controls every microsecond and millisecond of what the communication is happening. Endocannabinoids, the cannabinoids made by the brain, are important for brain development. They promote the birth of new cells. They tell cells what type to become. They guide them to their targets and help them form connections. And this is a critical phase during the development of a fetus. To increase the brain size massively starts from a single cell. It ends up with 80 billion cells and about 1 trillion connecting cells. And the endocannabinoids are critical for telling a number of these cells all these functions. THC in cannabis interferes with the developing fetus brain. It changes the signaling systems. It creates mistakes in neuron migration. It reorganizes the circuitry. It changes the type of nerve cells. What are some of the functional outcomes? Marijuana use in pregnancy increases the risk of preterm deliveries. It increases the risk of admission to the neonatal intensive care unit. It decreases mean birth weight. It decreases head circumference. It also can give rise to more non-deliveries, premature deliveries that end in death. The prenatal cannabis exposure, which has been uncovered by the ABCD program, the Adolescent Brain Cognitive Development Study in the US, has shown that kids exposed to marijuana in utero have more psychiatric problems, psychotic-like experiences. They have reduced white matter and gray matter. They have functional problems in terms of attention and thinking, reduced cognition, social problems, and sleep disorders. These are psychosis proneness. This is the difference. There's a higher incidence of them in 9-year-olds who've been exposed in utero. There's a whole group, this just came out, another ABCD discovery of all the mental health burden of children who've been exposed compared to non-exposed in terms of rule breaking, conduct problems, social problems, aggressive behavior, psychotic-like problems, ADHD-like problems. So prenatal cannabis exposure changes the brain in terms of signaling, cell migration errors, cortical circuitry, nerve cell changes, and lower white matter. At birth, there are these changes that we've described, and there's functional deficits in terms of thinking, attention, reduced cognition. There's social problems, including conduct problems and rule breaking, psychosis, proneness, and sleep problems, which I haven't talked about. What are the lessons learned from this? Medical public education is inadequate on negative consequences. Inadequate or absent safety evidence for chronic multiple uses in pregnant women. There's purposeful distortions that dominate the media, and science and skeptics are ignored. Vast sums of money are spent to promote to the medical community. Humanitarian pleas, again, are motivated by financial concerns. There's a new wave of unregulated high-potency drugs, and rogue clinics proliferate, and there's media promotion. What about the risks to the adolescent and consequences? In terms of brain development, addiction, educational achievement, employment outcomes, problems in adulthood, and other substance use. More youth in the US are using marijuana daily now than ever in our history. Ever in our history. These are 12th grades, 10th grades, and 8th grade students. The developing adolescent brain is also undergoing tremendous changes in terms of increasing gray and white matter, pruning connections, strengthening other connections, changing function regionally. The pruning piece is very critical for normal brain development. There's just not enough time to go through all of this, but THC accumulates in brain. It is released in the bloodstream as long as 5 days to weeks with heavy regular use. Neurodevelopment effects may persist weeks to years after use, and marijuana affects development, circuit maturation, and impairs brain function. Brain imaging has shown many changes in the adolescent brain, some robust changes, but this is a deep dive that our lab and Yasmin Hurd's lab at Mount Sinai, New York, have simultaneously uncovered. This was a deep dive we took, looking at the changes in what we call transcriptomics, in DNA expression in brain, and also in proteomics, which is looking at changes in protein expression in the developing adolescent brain. This was done in primates. Yasmin Hurd did it in rodents. We came out with exactly the same data. What brain region to start? We looked at the amygdala. Both labs independently decided to look at this region because it contributes to Darwinian survival. It controls behaviors that are necessary for food and water foraging. It assesses resources and threats and safety, and it responds to internal states. And signals are manifest as anxiety and fear and discretion in this tiny little almond-shaped part of the brain. Damage to the amygdala impairs these functions. And in 3 different labs, because I wanted it verified. This was done at MIT. It was also done at the University of Toronto. The leading person, Dr. George, was the first to show this in our joint collaboration. Sarah Withy from my lab and Dr. Miriam Hyman from MIT showed that the presence of THC daily given to primates increased this protein in the brain called glial fibrillary acidic protein, or GFAP, which is a marker of inflammation. The most alarming thing is that we didn't find it in the adult brain, only the adolescent. And what is the meaning of this? This brain region is implicated in the consequences of heavy cannabis use. It's implicated in depression, anxiety, compromised cognition, psychosis, and sleep disturbances. We also found that in these adolescent brains, the cannabinoid receptor, CB1, was vastly decreased. And Yasmin Hurd found exactly the same in rats, more GFAP and more. What are the possible outcomes of this? We still don't know. In fact, we're trying to, we're writing a grant as we speak on the airplane here and going back. This is what I've been doing to try to correlate this finding because it's new and we still don't understand the full implications of it. But we do know that adolescents are at much greater risk for marijuana use disorder compared to the adult. We know that marijuana compromises education. It has tremendous impact on educational achievement in terms of grades. Kids are more likely to drop out, less likely to enter college. They're more likely to delay enrollment in college or just drop out completely, and more likely to drop out of college. This is an older study, a longitudinal study, showing that the more marijuana is used as a teen, the less likely a person is to have a bachelor's degree from college, more likely to be on welfare and unemployed. There's also suspected cannabis suicide exposures in 14 to 18-year-olds. From 2009 to 2021, we saw an increase in suicides that were reported to U.S. poison centers by age group in which cannabis was implicated in suicide. If you compare adolescents that are non-users with moderate users, with adolescents that have cannabis use disorder, this was just published. It just came out in May, so this is hot off the press by Sultan and Zangolfs and Quasira 11. What they found was that even if a child is not addicted to cannabis, they still show problems associated with mental health. So non-disordered cannabis use means they don't have a cannabis use disorder. They are moderate users compared to non-users, compared to those who have a frank cannabis use disorder. There is a dose response with regard to mental health. With regard to cognition, even if they're moderate, they still have compromised cognition. If they have a cannabis use disorder, it's more extreme. And the same is true for concentrating. The same is true for truancy. The same is true for academic achievement. This just came out with a very large number. The same is true for arrest rates, for fighting, and for aggression. The use in adolescence is associated with more substance use and problems in later life. The probability of using other illicit drugs is 20-fold higher if you use during adolescence and continue. to be a high-risk alcohol drinker, to smoke daily, to be less likely in relationships. All of these. The use of cannabis is also associated with other substance use. Much higher propensity to smoke cigarettes if you use cannabis, to binge on alcohol, to use alcohol heavily, to use addictive drugs, other illicit drugs. Adolescent cannabis users are much more likely to use hallucinogens. If they use no marijuana, much less likely. If they use marijuana 100 times, much more likely to use hallucinogens. And marijuana use before age 18 has the highest risk for opioid use disorder, higher than almost any other of these social, environmental, individual factors, including gender and obesity and race and alcohol, education, age, health, mental illness. There's also increasing evidence that adolescent marijuana use can compromise physical health, including sleep, including lung function, including reproduction, including heart and cardiovascular system, including the gastrointestinal system and the hormonal system, all of these. Adolescent marijuana users are more susceptible to brain changes, to addiction, to deficits in cognition, amotivation, psychiatric symptoms, and function and health and safety. The safety consequences of cannabis, one of the most important ones that's emerging is psychosis and schizophrenia. We don't have time to go through all the information, but quite simply, what is psychosis? It involves suspiciousness or paranoia. It involves bizarre thoughts or delusions. It involves fragmented thoughts, disordered thoughts, and it involves hallucinations, auditory, visual, and sensory, all of these. Now, a lot of people have said it's not a causation issue. Cannabis doesn't cause psychosis, it doesn't cause schizophrenia, that's just a myth. It's just people who have these problems want to use it for comfort. So what is the difference between causation and correlation? Here's a very good example. In the summertime, the sun shines. As it gets colder, the snow comes. And in summertime, more people drink lemonade and eat watermelon. In the summertime, more people have heart attacks. And in the summertime, more wars are started or ramp up. Does that mean that watermelon causes wars? Does that mean that heart attacks cause wars or lemonade? Of course not. That's absurd. But that's an idea of how correlations can be misinterpreted and misconstrued. What are some of the quick examples of evidence of causation versus correlation with regard to psychosis? The frequency of use of marijuana and the dose of marijuana in London and Amsterdam and in Paris, done by Marta de Forti from England, shows that the more frequent you use, the higher the marijuana concentration of THC, the more likely to develop a psychosis. Cannabis use disorder and schizophrenia, this just came out. Again, this is hot off the press. It came out May of this year. We're still in May. That if people don't, this is a huge study. It was from a Danish cohort of 6.9 million people. And what they found is that if 16 to 20-year-olds, if they use marijuana, the males are more susceptible. If they have cannabis use disorder, they're more susceptible to having schizophrenia than females. And that susceptibility remains the same but is lower as you use marijuana at later ages compared to earlier onset of use. And females eventually catch up and surpass men at older ages. So 20%, this was the estimate, of schizophrenia cases in young males could be prevented by averting cannabis use disorder. And the cannabis use disorders may even be higher, 25 to 30% for males. So early detection is critical, particularly for 16 to 25-year-olds. Psychosis associated with marijuana is rising with frequent users. Again, we're seeing that. This is a study published in the States. How many more cases do we need to be worried about? This came out just again this month, that the risk of cannabis use disorder is much higher. It confers a higher risk for bipolar disorder, another severe mental disorder. So is it causality or association? In terms of these 6-factor analysis, specificity, biological plausibility, dose response, timing, consistency, strength of association, there's good evidence for all of them. It's still not final and conclusive, but it's real. Impaired driving, there's also tremendous problems with impaired driving. So what is the impact of commercial industry? It's worse than we thought. Potencies increased 4 times. Marijuana use, the highest levels ever for 19 to 30 years old. The highest use for daily use, for cannabis use disorder, emergency department visits, at-home exposures, driving under the influence, regular users, and high potency. So legalization has given us more access, more frequent users, more daily users, more cannabis use disorders. It's given us more products with higher potency and child appear. It's given us more consequences in terms of psychosis, addiction, traffic accidents, and fatalities. What can you do? One of the important things that we just published a couple of years ago was that young people living in households where parents use marijuana, they're much more likely to use themselves. And that's 12 to 17-year-old or 18 to 30-year-olds. So go forth and speak out on the hazards of drug use during pregnancy, on the hazards of drug use in adolescence, on the hazards of potent drugs, on the importance of parental influence on offspring use. And just remember this, because tomorrow I'll finish these two missing areas. The lessons learned from cannabis are very similar to some of the lessons learned from opioids, to ketamine, and soon to be hallucinogens. And I will close by saying, as I always do, this is not a war on drugs. It is a defense of our brains, the repository of our humanity, and we must remember that always. Thank you. Almost on time.